And we are recording. Okay, so we know from the header of the speech that this was a speech given in Glasgow, Scotland, March 26th of 1860. Okay, um, so for me, the couple of things kind of come into play. So how the preface kind of starts, and then how he ends the preface, right? So he talks about, so on page, what is this? We'll call it page 46, the last statement on the preface. And he says, in time, Douglass's constitutional vision became a reality, right? I don't know if I completely agree with that. And we could talk about that, when we get into group discussion or when we get into classroom discussion. But keep that in the back of your mind as you begin to read how Douglass articulates his vision of the Constitution. Think about our now, and do you feel that Douglass's vision aligns with what's going on in our world today? Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. Um, so he also draws a distinction, and we find this distinction on page 49, between the American government and how the American government operates and how the Constitution is written, right? And he says we should kind of separate the way that we look at the two, right? The Constitution and the American government cannot be collapsed. They cannot be viewed as one and the same. They're two separate entities. They're not synonymous, right? So why does that become important? And then later down in the page, on page 49, he poses the real question, right? And he says the real question between the parties differing at this point in America may be fairly stated thus. Does the United States Constitution guarantee to any class or description of people in that country the right to enslave or hold as property any other class or description of people in that country? So he says this is the real question when looking at and dealing with the Constitution, right? Then he gives us his definition of the Constitution. I'm not going to read all of it because it's pretty long, but it's on page, 50, I believe it is. Yeah, on page 50, kind of towards the middle of the page here. Again, I'm not going to read it all. I'll just read a portion of it, though. Douglass states, what is the Constitution? It is no vague, indefinite, floating, unsubstantial something, called according to any man's fancy, now a weasel and now a whale. But it is something substantial. It is a plainly written document, not in Hebrew nor in Greek, but in English, beginning with a preamble, fitted out with articles, sections, provisions, and clauses, defining the rights, powers, and duties to be secured, claimed, and exercised under its authority. Right? So this is how he defines and how he articulates the American Constitution. And then he also goes into this interesting move I found, and he says what's not important is the intentions of those who wrote the Constitution, right? What's important is what they put down on paper, right? So let's forget about the fact that while Thomas Jefferson was writing the Constitution, he himself had enslaved Africans, right? Like that's not important, but what is important is what Thomas Jefferson wrote on paper, according to Douglass, okay? And we can decide if we agree with that or not. And then he asks another question I think that is worth discussing, and it's on page 51, on the last paragraph. He says, what will the people of America 100 years hence care about the intentions of the men who framed the Constitution of the United States? These men were for a day, for a generation, but the Constitution is for ages. And in hundreds of years hence, the very names of the men who took part in framing that instrument will, perhaps, be blotted out or forgotten, right? So he's saying that we don't need to worry about the men who wrote it, kind of continuing his argument against not worrying about their intentions, right? Because they fade away, they come and go, right? Their names may even be removed from the Constitution, but the Constitution itself will remain, right? This is his argument. Furthermore, people 100 years from 1860, so in 1960, no one will even worry about who wrote the Constitution. So again, I ask you guys in 2021, does it matter to you who wrote the Constitution and the intentionality behind the people who wrote the Constitution? And then he draws this distinction between the Constitution and then the American people and the people and the citizens within the America, right? And he says the American people likewise have made void their law by their traditions. They have trampled upon their own constitutions, stepped beyond the limits set for themselves, and in their ever abounding inequity, established a constitution of action outside of the fundamental law of the land, right? So he says the Constitution is good. That's not the problem. American citizenship and the way that they practice interacting with one another becomes a problem, right? They've gone outside the law of the land and set up a constitution of action that does not align with the Constitution itself, right? So another critique he's placing here. And we know in the first half of the speech, he spends the majority of it dealing with an individual who gave a speech prior to him that spoke of the Constitution as being a constitution supporting enslavement, right? So he spends the first half of his speech arguing against this notion. And he says that same individual misquotes the Constitution, and he provides the articles and the sections, right? I'm not going to go through all of them, but the one that stood out to me most was Article 1, Section 8, which he states, not Douglass, but the previous person giving the speech states, requires the president to use the military, naval, ordnance, and militia resources of the entire country for the suppression of slave insurrections in the same manner as he would employ them to repel invasions, right? So think about this and we'll see how Douglass articulates the same article in the same section. And we find that interpretation from Douglass on page 56. Now, I'm going to read this whole paragraph because it's important to understand the distinction Douglass draws between how the previous individual interpreted that article in that section and then how Douglass interprets that article in that section and what he would do with that interpretation. Okay. So again, starting on the top of page 56. I now go to the slave insurrection clause, though, in truth, there is no such clause in the Constitution. But suppose that this clause in the Constitution refers to the abolition or rather the suppression of slave insurrections. Suppose we admit that Congress has a right to call out the Army and Navy to quell insurrections and to repel any effort on the part of the slaves to gain their freedom, to put down violence of any sort, and slave violence in particular. What follows? I hold that the right to suppress an insurrection carries with it also the right to determine by what means the insurrection shall be repressed, right? So I can determine how I want to go about suppressing the insurrection, okay? And under an anti-slavery administration, were your humble servants in the presidential chair of the United States, which in all likelihood never will be the case. So he's saying if I were ever to occupy a seat as the president of the United States, which will never be the case, right? And were an insurrection to break out in the southern states among the slave inhabitants, what would I do in them circumstances? So if I'm the president and an insurrection breaks out led by enslaved Africans, what would I do in them circumstances? And here we go. I would suppress the insurrection, and I should choose my own way of suppressing it. I should have the right, under the Constitution, to my own manner of doing it. If I could make out, as I believe I could, that slavery is itself an insurrection, so pay attention to that. If I could make out, as I believe I could, that slavery itself is an insurrection, that it is an insurrection by one party in the country against the just rights of another party in the country, a constant invitation to insurrection, a constant source of danger. As the executive officer of the United States, it would be my duty not only to put down the insurrection, but to put down the cause of the insurrection. So, what he's saying is, if I were to hold office as president of the United States and an insurrection were to break out, right, it is my duty to put down that insurrection. And I should use any means at my disposal to do so, but it's my choice on how I want to do it, right? But more importantly, I would view the institution of enslavement as an insurrection itself. Does that make sense? Do you understand the distinction between the insurrection of the enslaved Africans juxtaposed to the institution of enslavement being an insurrection of itself? So if we were to take this analogy and bring it into our contemporary time, right? We could use the protest and the rebellions over the summer of 2020 due to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, etc., as metaphors for the enslaved insurrections, right? So what Douglass would say, if he were to hold office in 2021, I wouldn't be more so focused on those who are protesting because of the killings. I'm going to be focused on the stopping the killings, because the killings are the true insurrection, right? Because if George Floyd and Breonna Taylor would not have been murdered, there would be no need for them to protest. Right? So the real insurrection is the institution of enslavement that forces Africans to need to rebel for their humanity, right? So keep in mind that distinction. So on page 58, he makes another move in arguing against the previous speech given. And let me see. He's talking about the clause in the amendment that says if someone tries to escape enslavement, right, there's legal clause that will allow you to capture that individual and place them back on the plantation that they escaped from, right? But Douglass is saying that that clause is not for enslaved Africans, it's for the indentured servants. So if we think back to our reading that we had for the Capitalism and Slavery and Eric Williams, right? And he says that the African people were not the first to be brought to this country to work the land, right? First, it was the European indentured servants who were brought here to serve for a time. Douglass is saying that that clause that says anyone who runs away from their plantation, the government has a right to bring them back. Douglass is saying that clause is for them. And he calls them the redemptioners. Right, and I'm going to read the opening paragraph to page 58. The redemptioners, okay, a class of persons. Okay, I'm going to read, actually, I'll start at 57 and go to 58 because it'll make more sense. To whom does it apply if not slaves? I answered that it applied at the time of its adoption to a very numerous class of persons in America. And I have the authority of no less a person than Daniel Webster that it was intended to apply to that class of men, a class of persons known in America as the redemptioners. He says, there was quite a number of them at that day who've been taken to America precisely as coolies have been taken to the West Indies. They have entered into a contract to serve and labor so long for so much money, and the children born to them in that condition were also held as bound to service and labor. It also implies to indentured apprentices and to persons taking upon themselves an obligation to serve and labor, right? So he's saying that clause is intended for them, okay? And then he makes a move. Well, I'll skip over that for sake of time. What I also found interesting was the case of Rhode Island, right? Have we talked about in this class subversion, what it means to be subversive? Have we discussed that at all in this class? Yes, no, maybe, kind of.
I don't think so.
Okay. So subversion. So think on page 59, we have the case of Rhode Island, right? And in Rhode Island, they said after 9 p.m., if you're black, you need to have a lantern with you, right? So all the Africans in Rhode Island at 9 p.m., they came out with their lanterns. But they get arrested because in the lanterns, there's no candles, right? So they go before the judge, and the judge says, well, you know what? I can't deem them guilty because by the letter of the law, which states they must have a lantern, they have lanterns. The law doesn't say anything about having a candle in the lantern, so I must let them go, right? So they go back, they change the law, and they say, well, to have, if you're African in Rhode Island after 9 p.m., you must have a lantern and you must have a candle in that lantern, right? So all the Africans go out, they put candles in their lanterns, and they go out after 9 p.m. They don't light the candles though. So they all get arrested and they get brought back before the judge. The judge says, well, due to the letter of the law, I can't deem them guilty because as the law states, they have lanterns and they have candles in their lanterns, right? So they let them go. They re-amend the law and they say, if you're African in Rhode Island past 9 o'clock, you must have a lantern, you must have a candle, and the candle must be lit, right? So, of course, they comply. And then Douglass says, and if I had been a Negro at that time in Rhode Island, I would have got a dark lantern and walked out, right? So I would have a lantern, I would have a candle in my lantern, and I would light my candle, but the lantern itself, the glass would be dark. So this is the notion of subversion, right? The idea of outsmarting, outthinking, outwitting people of authority, right? So, and you see the subversion in how the judge is forced to respond, right? I can't deem them guilty because technically they're doing what the law says they should do, right? So they were able to effectively subvert being in prison for this law that's egregious. Does this notion of subversion make sense to you? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let me see. I think that's the last note that I had. No, actually, we'll end with this. I found fascinating the comparison that he drew between the Constitution and the Bible, right? And he says that the first individual who gave the speech, he situates the Constitution as a document that supports enslavement, right? But I'm coming and I'm situating the Constitution as something that supports liberation, right? Just as the Bible has been used to ensure enslavement and captivity and justify enslavement and captivity, the Bible can also be used in the case of Nat Turner. In the case of what we call liberation theology, it could also be used to ensure freedom, right? So it's not necessarily the paper itself that's the problem, it's how it's being interpreted and how it's being manipulated to do either good or evil that becomes the problem for Douglass. So those are my notes on the reading. We'll jump into our fishbowl. Is there anybody want to volunteer for the fishbowl?
I'll volunteer.
Okay, we have Valeria. And then just remember, if you have went twice already, you're good for the semester. You have one time to pass, and everyone, you again need to go twice. So we have Valeria. Does anybody else want to volunteer? If not, I'll call on people.
I'll go.
Got George. Anybody else?
I'll volunteer.
Okay. So we have Valeria, George, and Liliana for a fishbowl. Whoever wants to start it off, it's on you.
I'll go. So basically, with you just mentioned, what I got from the reading is that he basically wanted people in power. He still wanted people in power, but people with better morals, I guess. He kept mentioning Christianity, so I'm not sure if he meant like people with like. Sorry, hold on, I have to write. Yeah, just with better morals, I guess, but I'm not sure what he meant by like when he brought in kind of that, like if he was talking about religion and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What I found interesting about the reading, well, about the speech was how he, what was his tone primarily, because it's very, how do I say this? It's kind of like passive aggressive, but at the same time it's like very assertive, and and he's completely right to do so. And I like how he uses the point of trying to disprove the person who came before him, who gave a very anti-Douglas speech, as he put it, in order to show that, to prove his points about the Constitution, and how the Constitution, um, it the as you said, the paper isn't necessarily the problem, it's how people were interpreting it.
Yeah, I completely agree with George. I found it really interesting how he provided like so many counter arguments, and specifically like stating articles, and how he mentioned clauses, and how it wasn't necessarily the Constitution that he was stating, the other person, and also how, in a sense, like how the people who wrote the Constitution, he was in a sense right, because we don't really pay much attention to who writes it now. Like it's not as important today, which he was right about. And I thought I was a little confused about it at first when I was reading it, but after he like started to really, I started getting a better understanding of it, which I thought was really interesting.
Okay. Thank you guys. That was a really succinct and to the point fishbowl. It was impactful. Couple of things. So what I kind of gathered from Valeria, and she frames it as a question, right? Is like he wanted people with more morals and more values, and he wanted he viewed the ability to vote those individuals in as the ways to combat the ills of the Constitution. And then, she said he keeps dancing around this Christian thing, and I wrote Christian values, right? But let's open up our classroom conversation, kind of investigating that a little bit. Why do you guys feel that for Douglass to bring Christianity into the conversation is an important methodological move? And if you need me to restate the question another way, I can. So what can we assume that Douglass thought invoking Christianity would produce for the audience who's listening to this speech, right? What do you think that this would get them to think about by bringing up the idea that America is a Christian nation, right? And this notion of returning America back to its Christian values. Why do you feel that Douglass thought that that was important as it pertains to his speech?
Maybe because religion was like a really big thing back then, and everyone followed it. It was like kind of like their rule of life. And he says that maybe to like bring back the morality of it.
Absolutely, right? He's playing on their conscience, right? It's an ethical claim. So if you are claiming to be a Christian nation, and you're claiming that this Constitution is what is the guiding force of the nation, then let's be about what the Constitution says it's about. Also, I didn't mention this in my lecture, but think about how he starts off the speech, right? I'm looking at the end of the second paragraph. And he says, I think before I get through, my audience will agree with me is a very important phase of that struggle. So this notion of getting the audience to agree, right? This is what he's trying to do. This is what his aims is, to get the audience to agree with him, right? Also keep in mind that he's in Scotland. He's not in America giving this speech. He's abroad, okay? Does anybody know why Douglass was sent abroad? It was in the preface. Does anybody recall the preface talking about John Brown and John Brown's plan at Hopper's Ferry? It's in the opening paragraph of the reading. So it says, go ahead.
Didn't Douglas flee the U.S. because he was afraid for his own safety and because he was against Brown's own plans?
Correct. Yep. So John Brown, a white abolitionist, was going to storm Harper's Ferry in Virginia and start an insurrection, right? Douglas was infamously tied to John Brown. Douglas did not agree with John Brown's plan, right? So because of that disagreement and because of what John Brown was planning to do, Douglas went on escape, right? Keep in mind the time, okay? 1860. When we read W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folks, I mentioned in the mini lecture that he took his last breath while in Ghana, right? Part of that was by choice, no doubt, right? But what I did not mention was that Du Bois's passport was revoked. He wasn't able to travel back within the United States, okay? Now think about the temporal assessment of that. So Du Bois, we're talking about the 20th century, right? So, but this is before Du Bois's time. So if Du Bois has his passport revoked for traveling abroad and telling the world about the ills of Black folks within America, what do you think is going to happen to Douglas for traveling abroad and talking about the ills of America to Scotland, right? So we have to also keep in mind when George talks about the tone, right? He says it's passive aggressive, but it's assertive, right? He's picking up on that small tension that says Douglas is aware I can't say too much because I do want to be able to travel and go back home, right? But I also want to tell the truth, and I also want to be assertive in my claims about this Constitution, right? And that reality kind of speaks to the question that I posed for the breakout rooms, right? Why do you feel Douglas is such a strong supporter of the Constitution? And do you feel that his support of the Constitution is tied to his argumentative method? So what were you guys discussing in your breakout group as it pertains to that question? So, I mean, you all talked about this in your breakout room, so it should be just the same conversation, just with the rest of the class.
Well, we talked about how pretty much he was in support of the Constitution because it was not made to be to be towards slavery and like pretty much for it, but it was made for freedom and does not specify being like restrictive, but for freedom and liberty.
Okay. I agree with you, Esmeralda. And I think also to add on to that, right? It goes back to his positionality, right? As an African who freed himself from enslavement, traveling abroad to talk about United States politics, how wise would it be to come out and say, you know what, this Constitution that the U.S. wrote, that the world believes is something, is bullshit, right? And the authors of this Constitution are slave owners and they damn so, right? How effective would that be? And how would that situate or sustain his relationship with the U.S.? It wouldn't. So that's Douglas's reality and that's Douglas's time, right? But we have the luxury in 2021 to look back at the inception of the Constitution and to look back at what Douglas is saying as he interprets and understands the Constitution. Does it matter to y'all that while Thomas Jefferson is writing about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the rights of all men, does it matter to y'all that he owned slaves? Personally, I'm not asking you as it pertains to Douglas. As far as you in your personal assessment of the situation? Does that matter? It's not a right or wrong answer. Just your opinion and your thought.
Yeah, I think so because he's kind of. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think so because he's like kind of contradicting himself.
To
Absolutely.
me, I think it's just a little hypocritical because he's like, yeah, everyone should be free. Let me just shove these slaves under the rug real quick.
And I would say it's a little hypocritical. It's hella hypocritical. But go ahead, Janet.
I feel like Frederick Douglass kind of like calls them out on it while also finding like loopholes in the Constitution. He said, but like, you know, it doesn't explicitly say that we can't do anything. And I'm like, that's pretty smart.
Yeah.
I don't know how to add on to this conversation. My mind's going blank. I'm so sorry.
Okay. You know, I think for Douglass, right, for me, the way I assessed it, he did well with what he had considering his circumstances, right? But for me, I can't reconcile someone saying that you're about liberty and freedom, but you're enslaving human beings, right? But then there's this interesting little passage on page 60 towards the bottom of the second to last paragraph. And he says, unless you deny that Negroes are people, they are included within the purposes of this government. Now, we know, right, with the hindsight of being in 2021, that there's something to that statement, right? And Douglass throws that out there passively. But the reality of it, when Thomas Jefferson was writing the Constitution, he did not think of black people as human beings, right? So to me, that small statement that's on page 60 undermines Douglass's whole argument, right? The whole basis that he's arguing the strength and the fortitude of the Constitution is based on the fact that everyone within the United States is considered and afforded the rights as human beings. And we know that that's not the case, right? So to me, that's where the largest hole in Douglass's argument takes place. And he gives us the ammunition to kill off his argument, right? He says it himself. Now, I don't know if the individual that gave the speech prior to him mentions that or not, but Douglass mentions that. I think it would be better for Douglass's argumentation just to have left that out, because that's exactly how Thomas Jefferson and the authors of the Constitution viewed black folks when they wrote the Constitution. Those laws, those rights, they were never intended for those who occupy black bodies, right? So what are some other thoughts you guys had about the reading? Did you like it, dislike it? Was it difficult? Was it opaque for you? Just any random thoughts. How would you compare this reading to some of the other readings we read throughout the semester? You all right? I know it's the last day before break. But check it. Let's just engage in this conversation. We got 15 minutes, and we'll call it a day. Go ahead and speak on what you put in the chat, Kenny.
I found this reading kind of like the poetry reading we had to do a few weeks before. We had to like try and understand each sentence he spoke upon for the Constitution.
Yeah, and I think too, you kind of have to break it down like that because of when it was written. You know, the language of 1860 is a little bit more difficult to navigate and interpret. To me, it was a little bit more difficult than what we read of Du Bois, because again, Du Bois wrote "So the Black Folks of 1903." This is produced in 1860, right? So the language and the way that they expressed themselves back in those times makes it a little bit difficult to understand. Fatima, what did you think about the reading? Fatima? Alexander, what did you think about the reading?
Alexander's mic isn't working, so they might be typing it.
Thank you, Jana. Okay. Jasmine, what did you think about the reading?
I was a little bit confused since it's kind of hard for me to understand these type of readings, so I'm not really too sure.
So what questions did you have about the reading? So in your journal for your question, what did you pose?
I was a bit confused like in the beginning when he like started the speech, whether if this whole entire speech was he like talking was he talking in his like own perspective, or is it someone else
So
telling him?
what I would encourage you to do, reread it. But there is
Okay.
you're absolutely right in what you're picking up, right? So the first half of the speech, he's arguing against someone who gave a speech before him. So the first half, really the whole speech is a counter argument, but explicitly the first half of the speech is a counter argument, arguing against claims that were made by an individual who gave a speech prior to him. And then he kind of shifts this conversation into more of his ideas and his thoughts around the Constitution. So I would read it again, but try to look for the shift in talking about the other speech and then Douglas talking about his own speech. Jana, were you going to say something?
Okay.
I was gonna say that Alexander typed in the chat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I saw that. Thank you, Jana. But Jasmine, does that make sense for you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So looking at what Alexander wrote, he said he understood that he was saying how it's more human morals to have slaves by taking their human rights and giving them the power to the people who don't need it. Yeah, absolutely, right? It's immoral. It's just a contradiction, right? Nicole, what did you think about the reading?
Okay, sorry, I was in the middle of something, but so what I thought about the reading that wasn't already like discussed, but like I wanted to talk about how how it says that someone mentioned something about how they thought the reading was about yeah, sorry, my doors are open, but about how something about the Constitution wasn't what we discussed in our group was I remember someone said something about that the Constitution wasn't wrong, but the people in charge are, right? And he's talking about that good people shouldn't, but the problem is, how can you tell if that person is good, right?
Yeah.
Like, see it every day. People can act they're good, but like their real intentions are practically evil.
Yeah, and so to me though, right, and this is where again we find holes in Douglas's argument, right? Because he said on one stance he says that we can't worry about the intentions of the people who wrote the Constitution, right? But then on the other side he's saying we need to get people in places of authority that are of good moral character, right? But how could you quantify that, right? So at one end, you're saying like, let's not question the moral character of Thomas Jefferson because what's important is what he writes on paper. But we need to have policymakers and people in places of power that are morally just. So to me, you can't reconcile that gap for me. And again, I give Douglas credit just because of what he did, what his life circumstances, what he overcame, right? Freeing himself from enslavement, teaching himself how to read, teaching himself how to write, producing an autobiography, right, that details the horrors of enslavement, right. One of the things about Frederick Douglass that he used to combat the institution of enslavement was his body, right? So when he would go on tours abroad, he would take off his shirt and he would show his back, and you would see the stitches and the scars and the keloids and all the things that were produced from his beatings, right? And this spoke to his activism. His body became the site of the tragedy and the site of the trauma. What are you gonna say, Jana?
Oh,
What are your thoughts on
I,
the
I
autobiography, Jana? Yeah.
I had to read it in high school, and it's like it's kind of like a short book. It's easy to read, and it was interesting on how like he writes, because I noticed whenever like in this writing and also in his autobiography, he has like this good method of, all right, I'm gonna give these guys, like, the bad people, the benefit of the doubt. Just kidding. You guys are really bad people, and I'm gonna list out the reasons why. Like, he poses like like a really good counter argument only to tear his opponent down. And like I find that totally amazing.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons I assigned this reading to, is because it's a really good so for me, I wasn't more so interested in what Douglass was saying while I was reading this. I was way more interested in how Douglass was saying what he was saying, right? So the method of this read to me was extremely important. And Jana picks up on this. Douglass's method as a whole, when it comes to writing, is phenomenal. I think, again, this is from the temporal, right? It's from the time and the era that he was a byproduct of. They didn't have the luxury in 18 whatever to say, you know what, uh, America's some bullshit, right? You just can't come off like that. So you had to find creative ways to express your grievances without sounding too accusatory or too attacking, right? So satire becomes important, right? Irony becomes important, right? What George said, tone becomes important, right? So I could say something becoming of the American government, but I could say it in a tone that undermines it, right? It's part of the method. So we'll call it a day there. Do know that we won't be meeting next week. Prepare for your midterms on the week that we come back from spring break, and then that subsequent week will be the actual midterm. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns. During our midterm review, I will let you know how many journals you should submit, and I'll also let you know where you stand as it pertains to your fishbowl. Do you have one, do you have two, or do you have none? The midterm exam is about question mark. Can you explain a little bit more, Fatima? It's like, what is the midterm about? Is that what you're questioning?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so the midterm is going to be about all the shit that we covered this semester up until this point. But we'll get in more details about that when we do the review. So when you leave out of the review, you'll know exactly what will be on the midterm, and you'll know exactly, what journals to reread, or if you want to go over a rereading. You'll have more of an idea when we do the review. Is there any other questions you got?